Honestly, when I first saw the trailer of Kesari 2, I didn't expect to be deeply moved. Growing up, I had already read and heard about the Jallianwala Bagh massacre countless times. It was one of those horrific chapters in Indian history that felt like it had nothing more to reveal. I thought to myself, what new could a film possibly show? It's a story of unimaginable cruelty, of injustice inflicted upon thousands of innocent Sikhs who had gathered peacefully at Jallianwala Bagh on 13th April 1919 to celebrate Baisakhi. But I was wrong. The film brought so much more than just a retelling of that tragedy. It gave voice to the silent bravery of someone we rarely talk about, Sir Shankaran Nair, a lawyer from Madras, present-day Chennai, who dared to challenge the might of the British Empire in court. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a moral battle against an unjust world, one where justice was buried deep beneath layers of colonization, fear, and silence. The film opens with haunting visuals, thousands of men, women, and children dressed in bright festival colors, filling the serene grounds of Jallianwala Bagh. It's a day of celebration, of community of life. And then darkness descends. General Dyer enters with his troops, emotionless, armed with not just guns, but with hatred and cold command. After a tense moment of silence, he gives the order and the massacre begins. Bullets rain down on the unsuspecting crowd. There is panic, screaming, chaos. People run in every direction only to find that every exit is blocked. Some, in desperation, leap into the well to escape the gunfire, not knowing if they will live or die. Others hide behind walls under makeshift shelters, but they are hunted. No one is spared, not the elderly, not the children, not even infants. The ground that was once filled with laughter and celebration is now soaked in blood and silence. Watching this unfold on screen wasn't easy. It made me question how much pain can a nation endure before it begins to rise. What's truly ironic and deeply unsettling is that while the massacre at Jallianwala Bagh was unfolding, Advocate Shankaran Nair was being honoured with the title of knighthood by the British Crown. He was celebrated not for a moral victory, but for securing a conviction against a man named Kirpal Singh, a professor accused of terrorism. At that time, it seemed like a proud moment, but beneath the surface, it was much more complicated. To understand why, we need to go back to the First World War. When the British Empire found itself weakened during the war, it turned to India for support. In exchange for Indian participation, they made a grand promise, freedom after victory, and Indians full of hope and trust gave their blood, their lives, their sons to a war that wasn't theirs. But once the war ended and the British emerged victorious, they conveniently forgot their promise. The betrayal was sharp, and it lit a fire of resistance across the country. Kirpal Singh was one such voice of resistance, a professor and a former soldier who had served in the war. He began speaking publicly about how the British had betrayed the Indian people. His words inspired many, especially the youth, to rise, to question, and to fight back. Naturally, this did not sit well with the British authorities. Pressure mounted on the then Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer to silence Kirpal Singh. O'Dwyer, acting on advice from his Indian advisor Tirath Singh, turned to the most respected and undefeated lawyer of the time, Advocate Shankaran Nair. Shankaran Nair agreed to take the case. With his trademark sharp logic and persuasive courtroom presence, he laid out a chilling narrative that the young boys who had bombed a British office and killed an officer were Kirpal Singh's students, and that because Kirpal had military experience from the war, he knew how to make bombs and had passed on that knowledge to his students. The courtroom gasped. It was a revelation that sealed Kirpal Singh's fate. He was convicted as a terrorist and sent to prison. But the most powerful moment came not inside the courtroom, but outside it. As Kirpal Singh was being taken away, he looked at Shankaran Nair, not with hatred but with sorrow, and said something that stayed with him. "You have a brilliant mind, but sadly you are using it to fight for the wrong side." That one line hit him hard, because in that moment, the audience too is forced to question, what is justice really? Is it just about winning a case, or is it about standing for what is right, even if it means standing alone? When news of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre finally reached Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer, his first reaction wasn't horror at the loss of innocent lives. It was fear. Fear that this unspeakable act might ignite a nationwide rebellion. He lashed out at Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, the man responsible for the massacre, but Dyer remained eerily calm. In his chilling arrogance, he believed that as long as they controlled the narrative, as long as not a word escaped, they would bury the truth with the bodies. Once again, Tirath Singh, the loyal Indian advisor, stepped in. To suppress the truth, he orchestrated the burning of local newspaper presses, destroying the very voices that could have told the world what had happened. The plan was cruelly simple: silence the witnesses and erase the evidence. But the truth has a way of surviving even when buried deep. The cover-up grew darker. When the bodies began to pile up, Tirath pointed out that the cremation grounds were overwhelmed. He asked Dyer, "What do we do with the corpses?" And Dyer, in perhaps one of the most horrifying lines I have heard, coldly replied, "Throw them in the sewers." Tirath was shocked at the sheer monstrosity of British brutality. Dyer wasn't just a man who gave an order, he was a man without conscience, without a flicker of regret. His heart was untouched by the cries of children, the screams of mothers, the silence of the dead. To quiet the protests that followed, the British took another inhuman step. They offered 25 rupees as compensation to the families of the victim. Just 25 rupees for a father, a son, a daughter, a mother. And in exchange, the grieving families were made to sign a document swearing they had no complaint against the British Empire. It was a sinister trade, dignity for silence. But not everyone bowed their heads. Some refused the money. One of them was the young son of Kirpal Singh, the same professor convicted earlier. Every day, this boy stood outside the British office holding posters he had drawn of the massacre. Each sketch was a scream against silence, a refusal to forget, a refusal to forgive. Watching this, Tirath knew this was not over. This boy's quiet defiance was a warning that truth, once awakened, does not sleep again, that a storm was coming and no amount of fire, silence, or bribes could hold it back. With pressure mounting and unrest simmering just beneath the surface, Tirath Singh came up with what the British believed was a brilliant political move to form the Hunter Commission. But this was no honest attempt at justice. It was a calculated strategy. The idea was to fill the commission with loyalists, people who would say that they were told, write what they were instructed, and ultimately give a clean chit to General Dyer, a stage-managed investigation with a pre-decided conclusion. To give it a facade of fairness, they included 3 Indian members on the committee. One of them was Sir Shankaran Nair. Including Indians, they thought would pacify the public, would make it look like justice was being pursued. But what they didn't anticipate was that Shankaran Nair was not a man who could be controlled. As the proceedings began, the members were briefed that those killed in Jallianwala Bagh were armed terrorists, that they had guns, and that the British forces fired in self-defense. It was a familiar narrative, paint the victims as aggressors, justify the massacre. But Sir Shankaran Nair wasn't convinced. He began to investigate, and very quickly 3 disturbing questions arose that the British had no answers to. First, why did the death count in the military records show far fewer numbers than what the hospitals had recorded? Second, if the crowd was indeed armed, why was it that not a single British soldier was hurt, not one injury, no return fires, no signs of resistance? How could a so-called armed mob die without even a scratch on the opposing side? And third, if these people were terrorists, enemies of the state as the British claimed, then why were their families offered compensation? Why pay 25 rupees per life if those lives were considered criminal? What kind of justice silences a grieving mother with money while branding her son a terrorist? Each question pierced through the lies. Shankaran Nair wasn't just asking questions, he was holding up a mirror to the empire, and what it reflected was ugly, cruel, and indefensible. By now, Shankaran Nair had seen enough to know that something was terribly wrong. The truth was being buried, and the British were doing everything they could to erase their guilt. Determined to get to the heart of it, he approached Tirath Singh not as an opponent, but as someone seeking clarity. Before Tirath could respond, the door swung open, and in walked General Dyer, cold, confident, and unapologetic. What followed next was something Shankaran would never forget. A wounded soldier limped into the room, his face bruised, body bleeding, but spirit still intact. His name was Janissar. He had served under Dyer, and now, despite the fear, he had come forward to submit a formal complaint against him. But just as he approached, Dyer snatched the letter and tore it into pieces. "Your problems are solved," he said flatly, as if crushing paper could erase pain. Tirath smirked, Dyer chuckled, and a humiliated Janissar, bleeding but unbroken, turned and walked away. That moment shattered every illusion Shankaran still held. Dyer wasn't just a brutal officer, he was the embodiment of hatred and racism, and Tirath, once a fellow Indian, had become numb to his own people's sufferings. As Shankaran walked out of that office, something caught his eyes. The same boy again, standing tall, holding posters of the massacre, refusing to forget. This time Shankaran walked over. He gently asked the boy to let go of the protest, to focus on his studies to secure a future. But the boy's reply left Shankaran speechless. "I am Kirpal Singh's son," he said. "While my father rots in prison, my mother and sister were killed at Jallianwala Bagh. Even if I study hard, I will still be killed because I am Indian. That's how the British are. They will never see us as equals. They will never give us freedom. They don't see humans. When they look at us, they see inferiors." These words hit Shankaran like a storm. They echoed in his mind louder than anything he had heard in courtrooms or commissions. Later, at a grand party, thrown in General Dyer's honor, Shankaran stood awkward and restless. He felt like an outsider in a space that pretended to honor him but truly tolerated him. Needing a moment, he walked toward the washroom. But as he reached for the door, he was stopped. A guard, without hesitation, told him he wasn't allowed in. Shankaran protested, "I am a member of the Viceroy's Council." The reply was chilling, pointing to a sign above the door that read, "Dogs and Indians are not allowed." And then Dyer appeared again, smirking, victorious. As a lawyer, he sneered, "Shouldn't you follow the law?" In that moment, everything became crystal clear. All the titles, the honors, the recognition, it was all a facade. A golden leash around the necks of brilliant Indians, meant to keep them obedient and controlled. And Sankaran knew this fight wasn't just about justice for Jallianwala Bagh, it was about freedom, about dignity, about reclaiming the right to be seen not as subjects but as human beings. Despite knowing in his heart that General Dyer was guilty, despite seeing the truth unfold before his own eyes, Sir Shankaran Nair's words in the commission room fell on deaf ears. He openly stated his verdict that Dyer was responsible for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, but the commission, already compromised and predetermined, ignored his judgment. They acquitted Dyer. Just like that, justice was denied again. Tirat Singh, ever loyal to the British, pulled Sankaran aside and warned him, "Don't to go against the empire, you will fall, and it will be a fall so deep there will be no coming back." But the damage had already been done. The weight of helplessness was already crushing Sankaran. After the commission was dissolved, he decided to visit Kirpal Singh's home, perhaps to offer some solace, perhaps to finally listen, but what he found instead shattered him completely. Kirpal Singh's young son, the same brave boy who stood with posters every day, had taken his own life. He had his wrist. A boy who once refused to be silenced was now silent forever. Shankaran was devastated. He stood in that empty house, consumed by guilt. He couldn't save him. He couldn't even protect his spirit. In that moment, he stopped being a knighted lawyer of the empire and simply became a human being, broken and grieving. Among those who saw his pain was a young lawyer named Dilrit Gill. She had always looked up to Shankaran, admired him, studied his cases, dreamt of becoming a lawyer just like him. But recently she had grown disillusioned. How could the man she admired serve those who killed their own people? Softly and firmly, she requested Shankaran to visit Jallianwala Bagh one last time, not as a lawyer, but as an Indian. Shankaran did just that. He walked through the narrow lanes of Amritsar and stepped into the garden that had once been filled with celebration and joy, but now it stood as a haunting reminder of brutality. His eyes scanned the bullet marks still carved into the walls. He stood beside the well where dozens had jumped in, choosing death over bullets. The water, still tainted with stories, still colored by memory, brought him to his knees. And in that moment, he broke down. The tears weren't just for the dead, but for all the years he had spent believing in a justice system that only protected the powerful. That day, Sir Shankaran Nair made a promise not to the empire, not to the courts, but to the martyrs of Jallianwala Bagh. He vowed to get them justice, no matter the cost, and so began this true fight, not in the courtroom, but in the hearts of a nation ready to rise. Just 2 days later, a tremor shook the empire, not with weapons or protests, but with a court petition. Young lawyer Dilip Gill filed a case against General Dyer, seeking justice for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. For the British, this was dangerous, because once the matter reached the courtroom, the truth would no longer be hidden. It would be out in the open and the public would demand answers. Michael O'Dwyer panicked. A case like this could stir the entire nation. He needed it shut down immediately, as the case had been assigned to Judge McCarty, a rare British judge known for his empathy towards Indians, who even allowed proceedings in Hindi. That alone was enough to unsettle the colonial administration. O'Dwyer turned to Tirat Singh for a plan. Tirat, however, seemed relaxed, even amused. After all, this was the work of a young, inexperienced, and in their eyes an insignificant female lawyer. The room burst into laughter, mocking the very idea of a woman challenging the British Empire in the court. But their arrogance was short-lived. In the courtroom, the laughter died as soon as Dilrit stood up and made an unexpected announcement that she is a co-counsel to Sir Shankaran Nair and he will be leading the trial on her behalf. The entire courtroom was silent. Faces turned pale, mouths dropped open. What they thought was a minor inconvenience had just become a storm. This wasn't a random move, it was a masterstroke of strategy. Shankaran had deliberately stayed in the shadows, instructing Dilrit to file the case so they could gather evidence without raising alarms. And it worked. The British grew overconfident, they mocked, they underestimated, and in doing so they let their guard down. Now it was too late to stop what had begun. Shankaran was ready, not just with the law, but with the truth, a truth the British could no longer ignore or erase. The courtroom scenes in Kesari 2 are honestly nothing short of riveting. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was a war of truth versus power. In those days, trials were presided over by a British judge, along with a jury panel, most of whom were, of course, British themselves. So imagine this. It was like pleading for justice in a room full of people trained to deny it. Still, Sir Shankaran Nair stood tall, unwavering. The first witness called to the stand was Kartar Singh, the Tehsildar stationed near Jallianwala Bagh on the day of the massacre. General Dyer's defense was simple. There was rioting, he had to take immediate and severe action. But Shankaran wasn't going to let that lie pass unchecked. He calmly asked Kartar Singh, if the crowd was truly becoming unruly, why didn't the police intervene when they started heading towards Jallianwala Bagh? Kartar hesitated and then replied, the crowd was massive. I feared it could spiral out of control, so I called for General Dyer. Shankaran leaned in. But you are a Tehsildar. Calling an army general would require formal procedures, authorizations, and proper channels. You skipped them all. Why? Why not call the nearby police station for additional support instead? Kartar Singh was cornered. His lips trembled. He looked to the defense bench for help, but there was silence. In that moment, Shankaran exposed the cracks in their story. This wasn't a spontaneous act of defense, it was a premeditated massacre. And then came the final blow. Shankaran revealed that before the massacre, a rumor had been deliberately spread that a famous poet would be visiting Jallianwala Bagh that afternoon. It was a bait. More and more people came, not just for the ongoing peaceful protest, but to catch a glimpse of the poet. And Dyer, he was ready. He had even allowed a reconnaissance plane to fly over the garden just to count how many people had gathered. He needed the numbers, he needed to know how many lives he could take. And to ensure there were no survivors, he locked every exit gate. As Shankaran laid out the truth, stone by stone, the defense lawyers sat frozen. No rebuttal, no excuses, just silence. The weight of the facts was undeniable. The judge, visibly shaken, ordered that further investigation be conducted and declared that the case against General Dyer would proceed. And just like that, the truth, long buried in silence, came roaring into the open. Michael O'Dwyer, watching from a distance, knew what this meant. The incident was now public. No more suppression, no more cover-ups. The Indian people had found their voice, and this time they were not going to stop. As the courtroom momentum began to shift in favor of justice, fear started to grip the corridors of British power. Michael O'Dwyer, now fully aware that if the case reached the ears of the British Crown, his own position could crumble, turned desperately to Tirath for a solution. Tirath, ever the strategist, brought in a name from the past, Advocate Neville McKinley. A brilliant legal mind, sharp in wit, fierce in argument, and a sworn rival of Sir Shankaran Nair. But here's where the story takes a darker, more personal turn. McKinley was Indian by birth, but not fully accepted by either world. He was the illegitimate son of a British officer, a painful secret that had followed him like a shadow. Years ago, he was a contender for a seat in the Viceroy's Council, but lost out to none other than Shankaran Nair, and this loss had left a wound that never healed. Tirath exploited that wound. He whispered a lie into McKinley's ear that it was Shankaran who had spread the rumor about his mixed parentage, and that's why the council turned him down. The lie hit its mark. McKinley, furious and betrayed, saw this as his chance of revenge. "You want justice," Tirath said. "Win this case, defend General Dyer, and you will not only be knighted by the crown, you will take Shankaran's place on the Viceroy's Council." For McKinley, this wasn't just about a legal case anymore. It was personal, a chance to humiliate the man he believed that had stolen his future. And so the British played their hand again, divide and rule, pitting two of India's greatest legal minds against each other. Not on the grounds of ideology, but through manipulation, deceit, and unhealed wounds. The British Empire didn't just conquer through force. It conquered through turning brother against brother, truth against ambition, and justice against ego. As the courtroom battle lines were redrawn, the question now wasn't just about Dyer's guilt. It was about whether Shankaran could stand firm against not only the British, but one of his own. The courtroom drama intensified with the entrance of Advocate Neville McKinley. From the very first moment he made his presence felt. He formally requested the judge to clear all journalists and reporters from the courtroom, claiming that the sensitive nature of the case could create panic among the public. Shankaran immediately stood up in protest. He argued passionately that the truth of Jallianwala Bagh must be known to every Indian. That justice, if done behind closed doors, would only serve power, not the people. But despite Shankaran's plea, the judge, perhaps fearing public unrest, granted McKinley's request. The court was cleared. Silence fell like a curtain over the truth. And then McKinley changed the course of the trial entirely. He revealed a shocking angle, one that had nothing directly to do with Jallianwala Bagh, but everything to do with emotional manipulation. McKinley introduced a new witness, a young British woman named Martha. Her presence in court immediately shifted the energy. With trembling hands and a heavy voice, Martha recounted her horrific ordeal. She spoke of being followed after college, dragged into a room, and brutally by a man named Tanveer Chaudhary, the alleged leader of Danda Fauj, an underground resistance group. The courtroom was stunned. Her story was gut-wrenching, her pain undeniable. Shankaran, like everyone else, was visibly moved because her suffering was real. This was not fiction, but McKinley was playing a deeper game. He used Martha's trauma to justify General Dyer's action. McKinley informed that Tanveer has already confessed to the crime, and after his arrest, General Dyer received intelligence that members of the Danda Fauj army were gathering in Jallianwala Bagh to take revenge. According to McKinley, Dyer's decision to march in with the military was not premeditated mass murder, but a preventive strike, an act of national security, a response to an imminent threat. The courtroom was unsettled, because now the moral lines were blurring. A survivor's truth was being used to defend a massacre, and the very real pain of one individual was being twisted into a justification for the deaths of thousands. But Shankaran didn't speak immediately. He knew this was no longer just about facts, it was about perception, and McKinley had just given the jury a powerful emotional narrative. The shocking new twist introduced by McKinley shook the court, and the judge decided to postpone the verdict, allotting another date for further hearings. But outside the courtroom, the real battle had just begun. McKinley, along with Tirath Singh and Michael O'Dwyer, launched a vicious smear campaign. They spread false rumors that Shankaran was defending a criminal, trying to protect someone accused of assaulting a British woman. The narrative caught fire. Newspapers ran it. Gossips exploded. Soon the public began turning against Shankaran, and one day, in a moment that exposed the raw ugliness of colonial power, a group of British loyalists ambushed him and smeared black paint across his face, an act meant to shame him into silence. But Shankaran didn't break. He stood tall, and instead of retreating, he and Dilrith doubled down on the truth. Dilrith began investigating Martha's college. She visited the location where the so-called assault had taken place and inspected the surroundings with a keen eye. Meanwhile, Shankaran quietly began going through Tanveer's belongings in his hostel. Something didn't feel right. The pieces weren't adding up. And then they found the clues. Clues that weren't just evidence, they were the truth. The case had been missing letters and a poetry book gifted by Martha to Tanveer. In those, the hidden story of two young people who had loved each other across a forbidden line, one Indian, one British. In the next hearing, Dilrith stood up, not just as a lawyer, but as a woman. She gently questioned Martha. When you were being dragged, why didn't you scream for help? There was a church open just across the road. Martha was silent. After the incident, Dilrith continued. Which hospital did you go for treatment? Martha lowered her eyes, no answer again. And then Shankaran stepped forward, calm, unshaken, and he revealed the truth that changed everything. Martha and Tanveer weren't just strangers. They were lovers, deeply in love despite everything society would say. But one day they were caught together by the principal of the college, and in a society ruled by prejudice, their relationship wasn't just taboo, it was dangerous. To save face and under immense pressure, Martha was forced to accuse Tanveer of rape. And Tanveer, to protect Martha's dignity, took the blame silently. He let himself be labeled a criminal so that the woman he loved could be spared. The courtroom fell into stunned silence, and you could feel it in that moment, the heavy, aching cost of colonial lies and societal cruelty. A love destroyed, a massacre justified through a manipulated story, a man condemned not because he was guilty, but because he was Indian. Although Tanveer was finally acquitted, his name cleared and truth restored, the case against General Dyer was still hanging by a thread. The courtroom now demanded more. The judge stated that while the arguments are compelling, the evidence remained mostly circumstantial. Judge asked Shankaran to bring a direct witness to the massacre, and only then can the jury deliver a conclusive judgment. For the first time, Shankaran felt cornered. The massacre had left few survivors, and those who did survive were either too afraid to speak or silenced. Who could he turn to now? And then he remembered Janissar, the wounded soldier who had once walked into Tirath's office with trembling hands and a heart full of truth. The same man who was humiliated and turned away by Dyer himself. Shankaran sought him out. Janissar, now frail and living away from public eyes, welcomed Shankaran with quiet dignity. But his spirit had dimmed. Due to his injuries, he had been discharged from the army. He can no longer had access to official records. Shankaran's hope began to flicker until Janissar spoke then. There is someone else, he said, an officer, a man who served directly under Dyer. He was there at Jallianwala Bagh that day, but he didn't fire a single bullet, not one. He fell ill on the field, and maybe, just maybe, that saved his soul. Shankaran tracked him down. The officer was quiet, haunted, but not broken. He had seen everything, the orders, the ruthlessness, the blood, and he knew what kind of man Dyer truly was. Not a leader, not a protector, but a monster in uniform. Moved by Shankaran's unwavering fight for justice, and perhaps tired of carrying the weight of silence, the officer handed over a set of confidential documents. And then came the next day of hearing, a day that might decide not just the fate of a man, but the moral compass of an entire nation's history. So Shankaran Nair rose and called his final witness, General Reginald Dyer himself. The courtroom tensed. The man who had orchestrated the massacre now stood face to face with the man determined to expose him. Shankaran began calmly. General Dyer, on the day of April 13, 1919, did you issue any warning before opening fire on the crowd at Jallianwala Bagh? Dyer's face remained stern. No, he replied. They were assembling to attack the soldiers. A warning would have allowed them to scatter. I ordered direct shooting. Shankaran leaned in, his voice steady but piercing. There were children in that crowd, some as young as 4. Were they also holding rifles? A murmur spread across the courtroom. Dyer didn't answer. Then Shankaran moved to the final thread, the incident that had haunted him ever since he met Janissar. General Dyer, he said, you physically assaulted a soldier under your command, Janissar, so brutally that he can no longer walk. Is this true? Dyer responded coldly. He said, he was late by 15 minutes. In the army, being late can mean death. I have lost men before because reinforcements came a minute late. Shankaran paused, acknowledging the gravity of that truth. I respect discipline, General. I understand the value of time on the battlefield. But that day there were multiple soldiers who arrived late, yet only Janissar was punished. He turned to the judge and said, General Dyer singled him out. He removed his boots and with his heavy iron shoes he beat Janissar until his legs gave out. That wasn't discipline, that was cruelty, that was hate. The room was silent, the weight of truth cashing over every person present. Dyer, who had spoken so confidently all along, now looked shaken, his words losing conviction. Shankaran had done what no one thought possible. He hadn't just argued a case, he had stripped away the mask of power and exposed the man beneath. A man driven not by duty but by arrogance, not by justice but by prejudice. As the case neared its peak, Sir Shankaran Nair delivered one final blow, one that would reveal not just what General Dyer did but why he did it. He stepped forward with a document in hand. General Dyer's confidential medical report. It had been provided by the only officer who refused to fire a single bullet at Jallianwala Bagh, the man who still carried a conscience. The courtroom fell silent as Shankaran read from the report. General Dyer has a documented history of severe anger management issues. He is prone to violent outbursts, particularly when challenged or humiliated. In states of anger, his capacity to make sound decisions is compromised. And then came the deeper truth, one that chilled everyone in the room. Shankaran revealed that Dyer's hatred of Indians wasn't born in a battle. It was born in childhood. His father, too, was known for his contempt towards Indians. Dyer had grown up surrounded by the same poison, and as a young boy, he had been mocked by his Indian classmates for his stammer. That humiliation had burned inside him for years. Shankaran looked straight at Dyer. You weren't seeking order at Jallianwala Bagh. You were seeking revenge. Revenge for a childhood scar, inflicted not by those who died, but by the hatred who chose to carry. And then it happened. Fuming, Dyer lost control. He leaped forward, grabbed Shankaran by the collar, and shouted in the courtroom, Yes, I waited for that day. I waited for the moment I would have power in my hands, and on 13th April 1919, I took it. I took my revenge. Gasps filled the courtroom. The silence was shattered by the sound of truth crashing into history. The judge banged his gavel. Order was restored, and then he announced, In the next hearing, the jury will deliver its final verdict. For a moment, everything paused. The weight of one man's hatred, the pain of thousands, and the relentless pursuit of justice had brought the court and the country to the edge of reckoning. As the walls began to close in on the British establishment, Tirath Singh panicked. He urged Michael O'Dwyer to fabricate a criminal charge against Shankaran to stop him in his tracks, but McKinley, ever the strategist, had one final card left to play. Just days before the final hearing, McKinley arranged for police officers to place Sir Shankaran Nair and Dilrith Gill under house arrest. The charge? Illegal possession of classified government documents. The very evidence that exposed General Dyer was now being used to silence those who sought justice. Shankaran and Dilrith were helpless, stripped of their voice, locked away, unable to appear in court. On the day of the final hearing, the jury met in closed chambers. With no one to challenge the narrative, no one to counter the lies, and no voice left for the dead, justice was quietly buried. The judge read the verdict aloud, General Reginald Dyer not guilty. The British erupted in celebration. Their empire had protected its own, and across India, hearts broke. Faith in justice crumbled. The names of the Jallianwala martyrs echoed silently in despair, and then came the most haunting moment of all. General Dyer himself, now basking in the glow of legal victory, arrived unannounced at Shankaran's residence, face to face with the man who had tried to bring him down. Everything I said in court was true, Dyer whispered coldly. I hate Indians, especially Sikhs. Watching them fall that day, it brought me peace. Shankaran stood frozen, no words, no reply, just disbelief and disgust at the monster who had not only committed one of the history's greatest atrocities, but wore it like a badge of honor. Defeated and devastated, Shankaran returned to Madras with his wife, his heavy heart, his spirit broken. The man who once fought empires with words now walked with silence. Dilrith too withdrew, her passion dimmed, her resolve shattered. The fire that once burned in her to fight for the truth now flickered uncertainly in the shadows of betrayal. Justice was not served, but something deeper had been stirred, a wound that would never heal, but would never be forgotten. Although Sir Shankaran Nair had returned to Madras, Jallianwala Bagh never truly left him. The screams, the blood-stained walls, the injustice, they echoed in his mind like an unresolved wound. He carried the weight of failure, of silence, of lives unavenged. One day, as he sat in quiet grief, his wife brought him a letter sent by none other than Kirpal Singh. With trembling hands, Shankaran opened it. The words within broke him yet again, but this time they lit a spark. Kirpal wrote that he knew that Shankaran has lost, but he also knew that he tried his best, and for that he thanked him. He also mentioned that his son did not kill himself. He knew his son well. He would have died for his country, but he would never take his own life. He was a kabaddi player, strong and brave. It would have taken at least 3 men to pin him down and slit his. He was murdered. Mr. Nair silenced, like so many others. As tears rolled down Shankaran's face, something shifted. He rose from his chair, wiped his eyes, and said just one sentence: "This fight is not over." He returned to Dilri. She too had been struggling, caught between despair and duty. But when Shankaran told her of the letter, something returned in her eyes: fire. They reopened the case file together. As Dilrit sifted through the original documents, Shankar noticed something alarming. The official jury verdict was missing. Digging deeper, they discovered an even darker truth. After declaring Dyer not guilty, the presiding judge was swiftly promoted and transferred to London. Three of the jury members had received large, unexplained financial transfers shortly after the verdict. It was now undeniable the entire decision had been bought. With all these new evidences, Sankaran filed a petition to reopen the case in the High Court. But in the very first hearing, something unexpected and deeply troubling happened. The judge dismissed the case. No explanation, no questions, not even a glance at the new evidence. It was like slamming the courtroom doors shut on the ghosts of Jallianwala Bagh. Shankaran stood up, stunned. "My lord, I have substantial new documents. Please at least look at them." The judge refused. Shankaran's voice rose, not in rage, but in pain. "Tell me, how much were you bribed?" he asked quietly. Gasps filled the courtroom. The judge snapped back, warning him. But Shankaran, now beyond restraint, let the fury pour out. "At you," he said coldly, a whisper of truth louder than any courtroom speech. The silence that followed was deafening. The judge immediately ordered a disbarment inquiry against Shankaran. Within moments, a warrant was issued, and in front of a stunned courtroom, Sir Shankaran Nair, one of India's most fearless voices for justice, was arrested. He didn't fight it, he didn't shout. He only looked back at Dilrit, his eyes telling her this is not the end. As Shankaran was led away in chains, those who had orchestrated his downfall celebrated like kings. McKinley, General Dyer, Tirath Singh, and Michael O'Dwyer saw this as the final nail in the coffin, not just of Shankaran's career, but of hope itself. But McKinley wasn't satisfied. He wanted more. He wanted humiliation. Global, irreversible, soul-crushing humiliation. "Call every journalist," he told Tirath. "National, international, let them witness his disgrace." Tirath smiled and agreed. And so came the D-Day, the disbarment trial of Sir Shankaran Nair. The courtroom was packed. Journalists lined every bench. The gavel struck. The judge looked down at Shankaran and said coldly, "Beg for forgiveness. Promise never to practice law again. Only then will you leave this room a free man." Shankaran slowly rose from his seat, eyes scanning the crowd of reporters, and then with a calm, unwavering voice he said, "I am sorry. Sorry I couldn't bring the full truth of the Jallianwala Bagh massacre to light. But make no mistake, these accusations against me are false, and to prove my innocence, I must present the very evidence that led to this conspiracy in the first place." The judge shot up, shocked. "This is a disbarment hearing. This has nothing to do with Jallianwala Bagh incident." But Shankaran was ready. He opened his worn legal book, turned to a page and read aloud from Bar Council Law Section 70. A small subclause, obscure but powerful, stated that in any professional inquiry, if the charges stem from a related case, the accused may present relevant evidence. It was a masterstroke. McKinley's jaw tightened. Dyer gripped his chair. Tirath froze. Shankaran then called forward a man sitting quietly in the back, the very jury member from the earlier trial. "You were one of the jurors in General Dyer's case," Shankaran said. "Speak the truth, loudly, for everyone here to hear, not just in this room, but across the world." The man hesitated. The room held its breath. Then, with trembling lips and tears in his eyes, the juror spoke. "Yes, I, along with two other jury members and the judge, were bribed. Our original verdict was guilty. We changed it under pressure. We were bought." A gasp spread through the room like wildfire. Journalists dove into their notebooks, pens raised. Cameras clicked. History, long silenced, was now screaming into headlines. In that single moment, everything turned. What they meant to be Shankaran's public execution became his resurrection. The truth that was buried beneath layers of deception had finally seen the light. With the courtroom still reeling from the confession of bribery and deceit, Sir Shankaran Nair stood tall, his voice no longer just that of a lawyer but of a nation. He turned to the journalists, the judge, and the stunned spectators and declared, "Today, justice may not be served in this courtroom. General Dyer may still walk free, but the truth has been set free. And through these reporters, this truth will echo across India and the world." He paused and looked around, his voice rising with conviction. "Let it be known that this massacre was not an accident. It was hatred, calculated, deliberate hatred. Britishers like Dyer see us not as people but as animals, creatures to be beaten, hunted, and silenced, but no more." And then, turning his piercing gaze directly towards Dyer, Shankaran roared the words that shook the walls. "Get the hell out of my country." The room exploded in emotion. Some wept, others applauded, and the journalists, they captured everything. The very next day, the headlines screamed across front pages. Dyer exposed, massacre confirmed, India demands justice. From villages to cities, protests erupted. Masses poured into the streets. The voice of India, long stifled, roared back with defiance. Under immense public and international pressure, the British Crown had no choice. General Reginald Dyer was dishonorably discharged from the British Army. Once hailed as a hero by the Empire, he was now a disgraced figure of shame. Stripped of power and abandoned by the very Empire he served, Dyer fell into obscurity. Humiliated, broken, and tormented by the shadow of his own crimes, he grew sick both in body and in spirit. 4 years later, he died of a heart attack. But history wasn't finished yet. 13 years after the massacre, on March 13, 1940, in a quiet hall in London, Michael O'Dwyer, the man who had greenlit Dyer's brutality, was shot and killed by Udham Singh, a revolutionary who had witnessed Jallianwala Bagh as a child. It was not just a revenge, it was the echo of justice, long delayed but never denied. The story of Sir Shankaran Nair is not just about one man's fight for justice, it's about truth refusing to stay buried. Jallianwala Bagh wasn't just a massacre, it was a turning point. And though the courtroom failed, the truth found its voice, and that voice awakened a nation. Even today, in every protest for dignity, in every cry for justice, the echoes of 1919 still live on. This was not just history, this is our legacy.